How concerned should you be with flooding in Orlando? How can you tell if you live in a floodplain? And what the heck is a floodplain or a flood zone anyway? Welcome to the Orlando Real Estate Lifestyle, where we explore the intersection of Orlando real estate and your best life. I'm Phil Kruse, here to help you make the most out of your journey in the city beautiful. Today, I'll be interviewing Del Schwalls, a professional engineer licensed in 4 states who specializes in floodplain management and consults many municipalities in Florida, the Southeast, and around the world. Del is such a big deal, in fact, that he flew out to Sydney last year to present at the Australian Floodplain Management Conference, and he will be featured on a documentary airing on PBS later this year. It talks about the recovery from the recent devastating hurricanes, Michael and Ian. Del, welcome to the Orlando Real Estate Lifestyle, and thanks for being here, man.
Thanks, Phil. Glad to be here, bud.
Hey guys, real quick, Del's office AC went out this morning. So if you see on YouTube any beads of sweat on his forehead, you're going to know why. He is not nervous. He's the floodplain man. And quickly, before we dive into the questions for Del, if anybody listening out there works for your municipality or has any high-level floodplain type questions, you want to go to schwallsconsulting.com. Go to his LinkedIn page, Del Schwalls, that's SCHWALLS, or just go to usfloods.com. That's a little easier. Also, don't forget, I am a real estate agent, and one of my main lead sources are listeners like you. So when it's your time to make a major real estate decision, or if you're sitting with a friend or family member having a beer, a glass of wine, think of me, Phil Kruse. That's Kruse with a K, Kruse. You can just Google my name, throw real estate on there, throw Orlando on there. You'll find my website. You'll find my social media channels. Hit me up. I'm here to help. A portion of every single one of my real estate transactions goes towards a charity of your choosing. If you don't have a charity that you want to send to, I will send it to the charity that I partner with, the New Image Youth Center, serving the underprivileged youth near downtown Orlando in the Paramore neighborhood. I would love to donate my commissions to that charity on your behalf. Now, before I ask Del a question, I do have a story of my own. Of course, everyone knows I live in Orlando. Del lives in Orlando. Hurricane Ian a couple years ago caught everybody here by surprise. I live on a lake. I'm not in a flood zone. At least the flood zone map says I'm not. The water came up in my lake at least 20 feet. My trampoline was not underwater, but the base was. It was completely insane. And anyone who lived here in Orlando during Hurricane Ian knows what happened in and around the downtown area and all over Central Florida, where lakes flooded, they connected. In the Thornton Park area, the Mills, like where Mills Market is, you could have canoed from house to house. It was completely insane. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of people to say, hey, man, I need to pay attention to flood zones and floodplains. So Del, with that said, what on earth is a floodplain or a flood zone anyway?
Well, flood zones and floodplains are 2 different things, although they're used interchangeably a lot incorrectly. A floodplain is an area that's supposed to get wet. That's where the flood is supposed to go. It's a natural area that when you have flooding, it fills up. It's also, this natural area is habitat for wildlife and endangered species. There's a lot of beneficial functions of the natural floodplain. So we spend so much of our time in the floodplain world and in development trying to convince ourselves that the floodplain is dry, and it will always be dry. But it's called a floodplain for a reason. And so it's a natural feature that gets wet when it storms. Now, a flood zone is an area of a floodplain that has been identified on a map for regulatory purposes. So when somebody says they're not in the floodplain, they're wrong. They may not be in a mapped flood zone, but everybody's in a floodplain. It may be a really low risk one or a high risk one, but they're 2 different phrases. And we have to do a better job, especially in my industry, of using flood zone appropriately rather than using floodplain because it gets confusing.
Yeah, no kidding. I have an engineering degree and have been a real estate agent for almost 10 years, and I did not know the difference between a floodplain and a flood zone. So when when we're looking at floodplains and flood zones, I've heard of FEMA, the federal agency for emergencies and disasters. How is FEMA involved in floodplains and flood zones?
So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is the agency that establishes the mapped flood zones. So after Hurricane Donna back in the 60s, there was so much devastation, and the federal government had to shell out so much money for recovery that they decided to establish a national flood insurance program. So this was a government-backed, government-managed flood program for people to buy flood insurance, because homeowners insurance does not include flood insurance. And so from that, FEMA started compiling all the different data sets, doing flood studies, doing the analysis to establish these flood maps. Now, these flood maps, by federal law, are supposed to be updated every 5 years. There's still some communities that have maps from the 80s.
Wow.
And even if you get updated maps, like here in Orange County, get updated maps, it doesn't mean the data is updated. So you may have a study that was done in 1975 that was rolled into the first flood maps that is still the map today for that area, because it takes money, it takes resources, it takes time to do these studies. And every year we've kind of established it, excuse me, we've kind of established that it would take about $450 million a year for FEMA to maintain the flood mapping for the whole nation. And Congress has acknowledged that, but they tend to give FEMA $250 million a year. So if we need $450 just to maintain the current status, and we get $250, you can see that we're not actually improving the flood maps.
Yeah, no kidding. That's obviously a huge concern for any homeowner, any citizen out there. I find it super interesting because I didn't know that. The listener may not realize that Hurricane Donna in the 60s actually directly hit Orlando and created a massive flooding event, not dissimilar to Ian based on the research I've done. It's interesting for me to know that a hurricane that hit and directly impacted Orlando completely transformed the federal government's way of managing disasters.
Yeah, it was the tipping point for sure.
That's crazy. So we rely on FEMA to give us the data and help us with the flood zone and floodplain maps. Does the state of Florida or the local municipalities come in and overlay their own flood zone or floodplain mapping on top of what FEMA does?
Well, they can, and they do, and they should. With the whole FEMA mapping process, it's built to be an engaging process with the community, the local municipalities, and the states manage a lot of that as well. So ideally, FEMA says, hey, we're going to redo your maps. What data do you have, local municipalities? What data do you have states? And the water management districts, of course, here in Florida are a big part of that mapping effort as well. So the goal is to take the existing data and roll it in. But once again, there's time, there's resources, there's limited funding. So a lot of communities will add their own flood data and do their own studies at the local level to supplement that. For example, the city of Winter Park had really bad maps for the chain of lakes. And so they hired a consulting firm, and I actually was with that firm back in the day. And so I actually did the study for the chain of lakes to update the FEMA maps, but it was based on Winter Park financing. So Winter Park had to finance the study itself because FEMA didn't have the resources. They said, we're not going to worry about it. And so it was either keep bad maps or pay to fix them themselves.
Well, that's interesting. So, the city of Winter Park, for the listener out there that doesn't understand, is actually its own incorporated city. They have a different tax structure. My assumption is they pay more property taxes in Winter Park than they do in unincorporated Orange County, for example. And if you live in Winter Park and you're upset about that, generally speaking, your taxes, your property taxes are going towards something hopefully good and hopefully well managed. And if you live in Winter Park, I didn't know this, so that would give me peace of mind to know that at least my tax dollars partially are going towards something to benefit the community.
Yeah, well, and with that study, it's funny, FEMA had water flowing uphill. So the water in the upstream lakes was actually lower on the maps than it was in the downstream. So that's probably not how it works. So that was a big push for the restudy.
Yeah, I think my 8-year-old has a good concept of gravity there, Del. So
Yeah.
I think you're right. Um, so we're segueing away from kind of the broad generalities of floodplains and flood zones. If you're a homeowner out there, Del, and or you're looking to buy a home, what should be on your radar? What should be the thing you're looking for the most relative to floodplains and flood zones?
Well, you want to do research yourself. You want to look at the FEMA flood maps. You want to look at the risk scoring. There's a lot of flood risk scoring out there, flood factor, some other ones. Uh, but you don't want to just trust one data source. A lot of times the MLS will have a flood zone on there, um, but you may be outside the map flood zone, but that may mean that a study has just never been done. So it's not that you're not in the 100-year flood zone, as we call it. It's just that one hasn't ever been delineated. And I want to go ahead and say before we move any further, the 100-year flood is not a flood that happens once every 100 years,
Okay.
because storms don't work that way. Nature doesn't behave that way. It's a storm that has a 1% chance of happening every year. And so when we talk about the 100-year flood happened last year, it doesn't mean we have a 99-year buffer. So like if you roll dice, you can roll snake eyes 5 times in a row. The odds say you won't, but you know that can happen. So it's a 1% chance of happening in a year. And so
Okay.
as you're buying property and buying a home, you need to make sure you understand the flood risk. So what's mapped in the FEMA flood maps? Are there any local or water management district maps that identify additional flooding? And find out if the place has flooded before.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, there is no law that requires the seller to tell you if their house has flooded before. And we've tried to push that. We've tried to push that for years, but there's a battle between conflicting interests there.
That's really interesting because when you sell your home, you are required to disclose any known defects associated with the home. And anytime I represent a seller, if I either visibly see a defect, if I happen to know about one because I'm friends with the seller, or if the seller chooses to disclose to me those defects, I am also bound by my license to disclose those items. And you're telling me that I'm not required to disclose a natural flood?
Nope,
That's
not unless the local municipality has a higher regulatory standard, and very few do.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
crazy. Because I know a lot of houses flooded during Ian that nobody would have expected to flood. And we have tons of people, literally thousands of people moving to Orlando essentially every day from California, from the Northeast, that have no clue about what happened during Hurricane Ian. So if you're listening out there and you're one of those people, be forewarned, reach out to me, reach out to Dell. And speaking of which, Dell, I mean, you're high level, you're dealing with municipalities, you freaking flew to Australia. My assumption is you don't have the capacity to deal with me, an agent, or the average homeowner asking questions about a specific address. Is there a resource, a website, or something that the average person can go to and find out this kind of information?
Well, you are right. I am spread pretty thin, but there's 2 great resources I can recommend to you. FL Floods, so
Okay.
Florida Floods, flfloods.org is the Florida Floodplain Managers Association. And they're a great first resource to connect with the floodplain management community. The other option would be the MAP Service Center, MSC, MAP Service Center. So msc.fema.gov. And that's a way you can actually look directly at the FEMA flood maps. But in general, if you just Google FEMA flood maps or flood zones for the community you're looking at, Orange County flood zones, Orlando flood zones, it's going to take you to the resources. And so it's pretty easy to find if you actually look.
Okay. And you said that Orange County in general is better. It sounded like you were implying that they're better than most, maybe at least as far as keeping their stuff updated. Is that fair to say?
Um, I no, but it's not on the county. It's not on the municipalities. It's just the nature of the beast.
Okay.
Orange County is a giant area. There's a lot of flood zones. I mean, every other house is on a lake here.
Right.
And so there's a lot of water to deal with.
Well, let me ask you that then. I live on a lake too. if you live on a lake, are you automatically in a flood zone? Is that how it works?
No, not necessarily. So for example, my parents have a house in Mexico Beach, which is 4 houses from the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
They are not in a mapped flood zone, but a 14-foot wave came through their house when Hurricane Michael hit. So just because you can see the water doesn't mean you're in a mapped flood zone. But if you can see the water, you're in a floodplain. And so flood insurance is definitely recommended. And because, we're talking about earlier with all that devastation from Hurricane Ian, you may have a homeowner that goes to a house and, it's been completely remodeled and this brand new house, everything's nice and shiny. And they're so excited about this brand new house because the developer or the flipper has just redone it. But nobody ever tells you the reason it was redone is because it had 6 feet of water in it. And so those kind of things get missed over and over. And people say all the time, nobody told me this house had been flooded 3 times. And I found out when water came in my house again.
That's crazy. And I can guarantee that there's going to be somebody listening or watching on YouTube that has lived that experience. And if that's you right now listening and watching, I apologize. I feel bad because, it doesn't sound like there's a whole lot you could have done. And, that's just life, I guess. And we're going to talk about flood insurance shortly, because based on these stories and what Dell's telling us, it sounds more and more important every minute. But before we do get into that next topic, I want to go ahead and plug my podcast. If you're listening out there, I think you just found a ton of value in what Dell had to say. I know I've learned a ton. I own multiple rental properties. I've lived in Orlando since 2001. I'm a real estate agent. I'm a property developer. I didn't know some of the stuff Dell's talking about. If you like listening to guests like Dell, I have a bunch of other interviews I've done, like one with Scott Katroba, a local business leader who owns a bunch of buildings and restaurants and bars in downtown Orlando. I interviewed the owner of Orlando Power Yoga, Kelly Sen. I interviewed a financial planner. I interviewed a mortgage lender, other business owners in the area. And of course, I provide real estate tips. I have general podcast episodes about how to sell your home fast at the highest price, utilizing something called the auction effect. I have a 2-part series about buying a lake home in Orlando, because there are so many lakes. And now we can learn a little bit more about flood insurance shortly. So if you like this kind of stuff, and also I provide lifestyle tips. Okay, so Orlando real estate lifestyle. I have one on an epic morning routine. I have an episode about how to sleep better and why we sleep, why we need to sleep. So it's a very diverse and eclectic podcast that's going to really give you all things Orlando and improve your life. Go on Spotify, go on Apple, give me a 5-star review. It takes 2 seconds. Okay, subscribe. You're going to get the notification of my new episodes every single Monday. I drop them every single Monday. You can listen to it while you're driving in. And while you're there, scroll down. You're going to see my contact information. My cell phone is there. Shoot me a text. I'm an open book. My website, I am Phil Kruse. Of course, you can find me on social media at Phil Kruse. That's Kruse with a K. Dell's information is going to be there. And don't forget about my real estate services. Look, real estate transactions don't have to be hard or stressful. Work with the right pro. Work with me. Okay, enough with the shameless plugs. Let's get back to what the listener really wants to know about, which is property insurance. How on earth do floodplains and flood zones affect property insurance, and where we go from here? You probably got a lot to say about this.
Yeah. So the first thing to note is that homeowners insurance does not cover floods, no matter what, period. You have to specifically add flood insurance to either your existing policy or get a separate flood insurance policy. And that's one of the biggest things that homeowners don't understand, is that it does not include flood. Now, as far as flood insurance goes, the flood zones do affect it, but not as much as they used to.
Okay.
So historically, FEMA has had a program where either you're in the flood zone or you're out. And if I'm in, I'm paying $3,000 a year. And if I take 17 steps to the right, I'm paying $800 a year, because they had these map flood zones, very binary, in versus out. Floods don't work that way. And because of that historic way of collecting insurance premiums, the flood insurance program was bankrupted by Hurricane Katrina, because it was never designed to withstand that kind of storm. And so ever since Katrina, the flood insurance program has been running in the red.
Hmm.
And so FEMA a few years ago redid flood insurance, and now they base their insurance premiums on the same way the private flood insurance market does it. The private flood folks know how to, bring in enough money to pay claims, but so they don't go bankrupt during a storm, but also not charge so much that they're gouging, the policyholders. So that balance works. And so FEMA has finally started charging flood insurance that way. So the flood zone, if you're in that flood zone, you're required by federal law to carry flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage.
Alone, right? Exactly.
So you've got to carry that flood insurance for those kind of properties.
So let me stop there. So if I'm a homeowner and I pay cash, I don't have a mortgage, and I'm in a flood zone, there's no law, there's nothing requiring me to have flood insurance, correct?
Right, exactly. Right. And that's what happened in a lot of communities like Mexico Beach when the storm came through. Most of those homes were generational homes. And so they were paid off, and people didn't have flood insurance because it hadn't flooded there in 150 years. But that doesn't stop the storms. In Orlando, during Hurricane Ian, I talked to so many homeowners in Delaney Park in my neighborhood who had water up to the steps, and then it kept rising. They woke up with water in their house. And I had this one neighbor I was talking to, and he said, yeah, I don't know. I had 3 feet of water in my house. I guess I'll file a claim with my insurance company tomorrow or next week. And I said, do you have flood insurance? He's like, well, I've got homeowners that covers it, right? And I had to have that conversation with a homeowner who just woke up with 3 feet of water in their house. And they found out at that moment that they had to pay for the repairs themselves. That's a hard reality.
Yeah, no kidding. And so what's the recourse? I mean, I swear I've heard of programs, and maybe these are specialty programs that are introduced as relief packages in real time. Is there situations like during Ian or Katrina where a homeowner without insurance can apply for a grant or something like that?
Well, you can apply for grants to have FEMA buy your house and demo it or remove it from the floodplain so it's never flooded again.
Okay.
I mean, because FEMA's goal is to reduce flood damage, right? Or you can apply for a grant to help elevate your house. But as far as programs to get you back to whole, there really aren't any. Unless you've got flood insurance,
right?
There's not a recourse. The federal funding that is available or disaster recovery funding is available for homeowners without flood insurance is pennies on the dollar. Because FEMA's not going to give somebody who doesn't have flood insurance the same payout that they would for somebody who's insured. I mean, it's not equitable. It's not fair.
Sure.
And that's just not how a bucket of money works. It runs out.
That's capitalism, right? I mean, you got to pay to play.
Yeah.
So because we're probably making a lot of people nervous out there,
Good.
Yeah, good point. Good. So if you don't live in a flood zone and you have a mortgage and you don't need it, and you have, quote unquote, you don't need it to maintain your mortgage.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Please.
The phrase is, it's not required for financing. That's a very different phrase than you don't need it.
I like it.
So it may not be required for financing, but whether you need it is a very different story.
Well, unless you live on the top of a very pronounced hill, I would imagine that you, obviously biased, but in a good way. I mean, you would probably advocate that everybody has flood insurance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, especially in an area like Florida, having flood insurance is pretty much a no-brainer. I mean, you've got to carry it. I live on the top of a hill in downtown Orlando. I'm literally at the top of the ridge. And during Hurricane Ian, water was 18 inches deep next to my house.
Wow.
And I'm an engineer who does flood studies for a living. And I was shocked by how deep the water was.
So, and I know you're not an insurance agent. And so if you're listening out there, I mean, Dell's not doing this so you can call him and buy insurance, and nor am I. But if you don't live in a flood zone, is flood insurance cheaper than if you did? And do you have any frame of reference on how that process works?
Yeah. So it used to be, like I said, if you're in a map flood zone, you may pay 3,000 a year. If you were outside, you maybe pay 800. That changed a few years ago. So now the flood premiums are based on an overall risk assessment that's independent of the flood maps. And we're
Hmm.
still trying to get FEMA to figure out how this is working because um, the science is better, the implementation is still broken.
Okay.
So in theory, your flood insurance might be cheaper if you're not in a map flood zone, but it's going to be more because the analysis shows you're at a lower risk and not because you're in or out of a flood zone.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's data driven, and we have so much sensor technology and satellites, and we can share everything in real time. It makes perfect sense that we could just take the last 10 years or the last 20 years since we've had the internet in all this the digital age and have so much more data, and that alone would probably based on history. Boom, you put the two together. I can imagine that's a lot more accurate.
Yeah, and the modeling companies who do these big disaster models, they are using the most current data. So as I
Right.
mentioned, the FEMA maps, some of them are from the 70s, the 80s, even if they're reprinted. So those flood zones are stagnant in time. The flood insurance is based on up-to-date analysis. You know, that if we could redo all the FEMA maps today, it's a better picture of that. And they don't just look at the 100-year storm because a lot of these storms have a lower percent chance, but they're happening. Hurricane Michael was not a 100-year storm. It's more of a 1,400-year storm.
Wow. So let me ask you this: if the homeowner out there right now is panicking, listening to us and googling flood insurance, do you think they're better served to start with a private flood insurance company or to go straight to FEMA? Do you have any frame of reference on that?
Yeah. So most of the private flood insurance companies are called write your own companies, and they actually manage flood insurance for FEMA. So a FEMA policy may be from State Farm or from
Mm.
Farmers. So FEMA very rarely issues the policy themselves. They rely on these partner insurance companies to do it for them.
Well, I mean, if the private sector can do it better, then the government should be doing that, right? I mean, private partnerships make a lot of sense in certain scenarios when done correctly. So that actually gives me some peace of mind. I'm sure there's a lot of cynics out there listening or watching thinking, oh, the government can't do anything right and my tax dollars are getting squandered. Well, if your tax dollars, are vis-a-vis getting shifted to a private insurance company, maybe we can sleep rest a little better. So go out there and get your flood insurance. I have a feeling I'm going to be doing that here very shortly, considering I live on a lake and I don't have flood insurance yet.
Mm. Well, and there are two different options though. You've got the FEMA insurance that is often managed by the private companies, and then you have private insurance, which is a different rating structure. So a lot of times you can ask your insurance company to look at both,
Hmm.
and they can tell you which option is the better option for your premium. So, for example, you may get a lower premium with a private flood insurance policy from State Farm versus a FEMA flood insurance policy. But the private flood insurance policy doesn't come with the regulatory um, backup and the regulatory benefits that the FEMA flood insurance policy comes from.
I
So, for
see.
example, if I've got a flood insurance policy through FEMA and it's 1,000 a year, and then all of a sudden they decide the analysis shows that I need to be paying 10,000 a year, the federal law limits the increase to 18% per year.
Hmm.
So to go from 1,000 to 10,000 at 18% per year, that's a long, slow slide.
Yeah.
Whereas a private flood insurance policy doesn't have that limitation.
They
So
can
there are
just jack you
benefits,
up. They can just jack you up right away, basically.
right? So
Interesting.
just because the private flood insurance policy is cheaper, it doesn't always mean it's the best option to switch.
Okay, cool. Well, that's amazing. And if y'all listening out there want to talk to me more about insurance, I have a great insurance brokerage I work with on the west coast of Florida. We can get you some flood insurance. I have resources like Dell that I could always talk to. So it's great. And thank you, Dell, for sharing all that. In the grand scheme of things, though, Orlando is considered high and dry compared to a lot of other parts in Florida. Some of the highest sea level elevations in the entire state. are right here in Florida, over in like the Claremont area. The downtown's fairly high relative to sea level. There's a lot of people out there listening that either want to, already do, or have dreams of, living on the beach. How does all of this stuff equate to somebody who wants to buy a beach home or live on the beach?
Well, buyer beware
Yeah.
is the best thing I can say, because there's so many areas in the coastal Florida that have been hit by severe storms, but there's a lot of areas that haven't been hit in a long time
Right.
or ever that we know of. For example, Tampa Bay hasn't been hit since 1920s.
Wow.
But when a Hurricane Ian or even a Cat 3, when it goes into Tampa Bay, the whole world's going underwater.
Yeah.
It's one of the most vulnerable locations in the nation for flood risk.
Wow.
And so you may say, "Oh, I'm right here on the beach, right here on the water. It's great." But when it's not if a storm will hit, it's when. And my parents were the same way. They wanted a house on the beach, Mexico Beach. And then Hurricane Michael came through. And you've got so many communities. Fort Myers Beach, for example. Fort Myers Beach, a barrier island community full of family homes, generational homes, got devastated, wiped off the map by Hurricane Ian.
Right.
But a lot of those folks said, I'm not in a flood zone. I'm good, and wanted that life at the beach, and they lost everything.
It's so sad. And I guess that's your point. Buyer beware. Like if your dream to live on the beach is so strong that you're willing to not ignore, but just live with those risks, you certainly get as much insurance as you can. And I know sometimes if you live right on the water, it can be extremely challenging to even get regular homeowners insurance and hurricane coverage. So, just be prepared and have some savings and a backup plan. We're talking about homes getting wiped off the face of the earth, and we're talking about living on the beach and things like that. There's different construction standards if you're going to be building on a flood zone. I know in Orlando, I'm a property developer as well. I build single family homes in addition to representing buyers and sellers in a traditional capacity. And so for me, my most exposure is building in a flood zone where they require you to bring in thousands and thousands of dollars worth of dirt to raise the entire foundation and generally the surrounding area out, quote unquote, out of the flood zone. And that seems to be in Orlando the most common way to address that. We're not on the coast. What are some of the things that you see, especially on the coast where it's even more prevalent? How do construction standards differ, I guess, depending if you're in a flood zone or in a major flood zone like a coastal area?
Well, you've got several steps of regulations. If you're in the coastal area, so you've got waves that you're at risk of getting hit by, then the regulations require you to be built on piles. You got to be elevated on posts or piles or columns to get the lowest spot of that house above the waves. And so that's the first standard of regulations. Now, there's also the ability to enclose that bottom area, but in those wave areas, that bottom area you have to be able to push it out. So basically, if I'm elevated on posts and I enclose the bottom, when the wave hits those bottom walls, the walls have to pop out instead of pushing the house over.
Interesting.
So that's kind of your standard. And then as you get away from the coast and more inland, then the rules get to where you've got to have your floor above the flood level in order to be compliant. But something you said about placing the fill dirt is an interesting nuance, because that is a very common approach to development in a flood zone. Let's raise the dirt and raise the property out of the flood zone. And usually it's followed by, so we don't have to have flood insurance. So it's not required. But when you're in a flood zone, when you buy property in a flood zone and you want to build, you don't have to remove the house's footprint from the floodplain. You don't have to place dirt to elevate that property.
Okay.
You can place a foundation that is below the flood level.
Yeah.
So a backfilled stem wall or an open garage, so that the water either hits that foundation or it gets in the garage and only damages, your storage area. And then elevate the rest of your house, your living space, above that flood level. Because when you place dirt in a floodplain to elevate ground, that water is now going somewhere else,
Right.
which is probably going to be to your neighbor.
Yeah.
And so you're reducing that capacity in the floodplain, which is always detrimental.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, in a number of my development projects, we haven't been in flood zones, and we've been required to put some pretty dramatic swales or ditches on the side of the home, the rear of the home, to divert the water to where the county wants us to go, wants us to push the stormwater. So if you're thinking about building in a flood zone, if you own a piece of property that's in a flood zone, you need to keep this in mind, because you may end up with literally a retention area in either your front or backyard that may pond sometimes, or certainly be a big depression. Well, thank you for sharing that, Dale.
Well, because with the water management district regulations, a lot of them have a requirement that for every cup of dirt you put in the floodplain, you've got to dig a cup of dirt out. So 1-to-1, a cut and fill ratio. So if you're going to place fill dirt to elevate your house, you've got to dig it out somewhere else.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. So much great insight. Del, that is it for my questions. You have been I knew you were going to be an amazing guest with great knowledge and resources, but you completely blew my mind. This is probably one of the most informative, if not the most informative, and maybe the most important podcast recording I've ever done, because it applies to every citizen, whether you're a renter or a homeowner, someone looking to buy or sell, if you're looking to build, if you're looking to move to Florida, if you're looking to move to the coast. I mean, everything you said is extremely important. So I want to remind the listener, especially if you are associated with your municipality, which is where Del really shines with his business, and you want to find out more about how Del can help with his consulting company, Schwalls Consulting, you either go to schwallsconsulting.com or usfloods.com. And of course, you can find Del on LinkedIn. His last name is spelled Schwalls. And don't forget, and keep on looking out. And I'm going to post on social media when it happens. So Del, make sure you let me know. We're going to be able to see this guy on this PBS documentary. When is that supposed to be released? Do you have any idea?
It's coming out in July. I don't know a release date yet, but
how exciting, man. That's got to be so cool for you.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Well, congrats on all your success, Del. I wish you continued success. To you and you listening out there, just know I'm going to have Del's various websites and LinkedIn profile directly on the episode description on Spotify or Apple. So after you're hearing this, scroll down, you can find it. It's going to be hyperlinked. You'll go right to Del's website and you could reach out to him that way. While you're there, again, my cell phone number is there. You can call me. You can text me at any time. You can find me anywhere online at Phil Kruse. That's Kruse with a K, Kruse. Google that, throw real estate, throw Orlando, search me on Instagram or Facebook. You're going to find me. I would love to help you. This is what I do for a living, is helping people. And with that being said, don't forget, a portion of all my commissions goes to either a charity of your choosing, which I can help you select, or directly to the New Image Youth Center, where I volunteer and choose to spend a lot of my time. And don't forget to subscribe to my podcast. Give me a 5-star review. Copy the link, but that little square with the up arrow, and send it to a friend. At least one friend would help me so much, or post it right on your social media. Probably even better. Del Schwalls, Schwalls Consulting. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy, especially dealing with your AC being out at your office. Thank you very much for your time today.
Appreciate it, Phil. Always good to see you, buddy.
You too, man. And for the listener out there, always know your best life in Orlando is within reach. Keep embracing every moment. Cheers.